Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is delighted to be collaborating with the Helsinki Commission in the US Congress to launch a new report titled The Ties That Bind, which emphasizes the importance of the rule of law and issues such as transparency, anti-corruption in the management of America's supply chains. It's a great honor for us to be able to work with the Helsinki Commission. It's a great honor for us to be able to host a number of very distinguished guests today to discuss that report. And for me, it's a great honor to be able to introduce our CEO and President, Ambassador Mark Green. Ambassador Mark Green serves as the President, Director, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which of course is a nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue. We work very closely with Congress, the administration, and the international policy community to come up with actionable ideas. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Ambassador Green served as the Executive Director of the McCain Institute, Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and prior to that, he was President of the International Republican Institute, President and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, and Senior Director at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Green served as the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from mid-2007 to early 2009, and before that, he served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Wisconsin's 8th District. Ambassador Green, thank you so much for agreeing to host this conversation with Senator Cardin today. We're especially delighted because this marks the official launch of the Wilson Center's work on critical supply chains. Next week, we will be starting a series of private invitation-only dialogues focusing on critical minerals. But we're so happy that you're able to be with us today. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, Ambassador Green.
Great. Thanks, Duncan. And welcome, everyone. You know, I think if there's an ebb and flow to human history, we all get the sense that the pages are turning a little more quickly these days. I think there's also a sense of crossroad moments along the way. And we're in one of those moments, or at least one of those chapters right now. We've just seen important signals being sent by world leaders at the G7 and NATO summits. And while there wasn't absolute unanimity, there clearly was a projected message of shared awakening, of a recognition of the challenges and long-term in vulnerabilities in some of the long-term structures and relationships, diplomatic relationships, economic relationships, and quite frankly, the architecture of freedom. And all of that makes the launch of the Helsinki Commission's report, The Ties That Bind, remarkably timely and welcomed. It also makes the Wilson Center the perfect place to host this discussion. You know, when the Wilson Center was created by Congress more than 50 years ago, it was given the mission of, and I'm quoting, strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. In other words, applying scholarship and analysis to key foreign policy matters of the day. Given the kinds of issues we see on the world stage these days, including both challenges to American economic leadership and the values and freedoms that have made that leadership possible, the Wilson Center has launched a series of new initiatives on strengthening America's alliances and strategic partnerships, and as evidenced today and referenced by Duncan, strengthening of critical supply chains. And we're working with stakeholders to analyze our supply chains on everything from critical minerals to health, aerospace, electronic vehicles, and also the broad principles underlying this Helsinki Commission report and their role in protecting those key supply chains. I can't think of a better person to lead us through this discussion of the Helsinki Commission report than Senator Ben Cardin. He is Maryland's senior senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on State Department, USAID management, international operations, and bilateral international development. Most importantly for today, he is the chairman of the Helsinki Commission. He first joined the commission in 1993 and previously served as its chair in both the 111th and 113th Congresses. On a personal note, I can say as the former administrator of USAID, I know him to be one of the most articulate, constructive, and influential foreign policy leaders on the scene today. He is a tireless defender of human rights and democratic institutions, and a true believer in the importance of American engagement and leadership around the world. Senator Cardin, welcome. It's good to see you. And by the way, I enjoy asking the questions. It usually has been the opposite in our relationship, but welcome to the Wilson Center, and I'm turning it over to you.
Ambassador Green, I'm very grateful to be here just to hear your introduction of me. I don't normally get that type of an introduction. But first, thank you for your incredible service to our country in so many different capacities. And I really do cherish the times we served together in the Congress, but your extraordinary leadership at USAID and now the work that you're doing at the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is one of our great hubs of innovative thinking. So thank you for continuing that tradition with dealing with the critical supply chain initiative. You said it best, this is an extraordinary time. The President of the United States is in Europe, met with the G7 and NATO, now meeting with world leaders. And it's the time that we are analyzing the threat to democratic states around the world and whether we will be secure in the future. We saw our vulnerability during COVID-19 of having a secure supply chain. So this is a critical moment for us to be able to analyze what we can do in order to preserve not just a critical supply chain, but how do we preserve our democratic institutions moving forward. So thank you for showcasing the Helsinki report. I want to acknowledge Paul Massaro, the architect of this report, for the great work that he did on our staff. I know he was helped by Rebecca Neff. This was an effort under the umbrella of the Helsinki Commission, which is known, of course, it's the implementing arm of the OSCE for us in the United States, but the OSCE is known for putting a spotlight on good governance. If you're going to have a secure country, if you're going to have economic growth, you need to respect the rule of law and good governance and human rights. And that's particularly important in regards to having a secure supply chain. So I just really want to thank Paul for his work on this report, and thank you for showcasing it because it's completely consistent with the mission of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, as well as the future strength of democratic countries around the world. Freedom House just recently gave us a report that should be sobering to all of us. We're continuing on a continuous decline of democratic states around the world. We're now down to less than 1 out of every 5 people living in a totally free country. That's alarming. We need to do something about it. And as we look at how we can have a secure supply chain, you need to look at rule of law and corruption. It's the other side of the same coin. These are similar issues. You cannot have a critical supply chain unless you deal with corruption. And corruption is the fuel that finances autocratic regimes. So all this is very much interrelated. I quote often from my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who one of the great leaders of the opposition in Russia, who says that Putin steals from the Russians to spend in the West. So he's using those corrupt resources in order to corrupt our society and corrupt our ability to have a secure supply chain. So this report, I think, is very important that we issued, that we have to restore the rule of law to international transactions, and this means effectively fighting corruption. In the short term, we need to choose markets where the rule of law is strong. In the long term, we have to build more markets where the rule of law is strong. So we need to do both. We have to isolate today, and we have to build more resilient democratic societies. I was very proud that President Biden recognized this with his declaration in regards to corruption as a core national security interest. That's the President of the United States. He recognizes that modern dictators hope to exploit corruption to corrode our democratic institutions. Now, we've known this. I issued a report from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in January of 2018, which was a warning to the West that said that when you look at Russia, they use an asymmetric arsenal to attack our democratic institutions. And yes, we go through all the different tools that Russia, Mr. Putin used. He uses his military, and the Ukraine understands that. He uses misinformation, and we've seen that on the internet. We've seen that on the attack on independent journalists, on opposition leaders, on civil societies. He uses all those tools in order to try to promote his agenda to bring down democratic institutions. He finances extreme groups, taking advantage of weaknesses within democratic societies. And then he uses corruption. Corruption is the fuel for these autocratic regimes. And if we want to have a secure supply chain, we have to deal with corruption. So what is the game plan to deal with this? The growing threat is well beyond Russia. We know the Belt and Road Initiative by China. It very much compromises the supply chain, where China wants to dominate the supply chain with a country where you have a government-controlled economy that has no respect at all for the rule of law. Our action plan to fight corruption needs to include, first, taking care of business at home. We've got to strengthen our own countries. That's why it was very important that Congress, in the last Congress, abolished the anonymous shell companies. We've got to work to make sure that you can't launder money in our country. The Senate bill passed last week that deals with competition, global competition, and recognizes China's threat. Strong bipartisan support, investing in integrity and rule of law here in America are critical steps we need to take to strengthen our ability to deal with this challenge. And then you have to target the kleptocrats, the authoritarian leaders, and you got to make them pay for their corrupt activities with sanctions. They choose not to keep their money in their own country. They want to put it in the United States and UK and EU. We got to make sure that's not possible. And that's why the Magnitsky sanctions were so important. So important. If you don't, we just want to underscore how important it was. It's been reported it was the first issue that Mr. Putin raised to President Trump during their first summit meeting. It clearly is effective in naming and shaming and denying these kleptocrats the ability to hide their money in the Western banks and to visit their wealth in our countries. Congress recently, in the bill that I mentioned passed last week, included a provision in the Senate to make the global Magnitsky statute permanent, and we need to deal with it. But our strategy also must include working with our allies to dismantle corrupt regimes. So that's why I am particularly focused on global Magnitsky being adopted by more countries around the world. So we work with our allies. Yes, EU passed the sanction regime against human rights violators, but it did not include a strong provision in those that are promoting corruption. And we need to strengthen the EU sanction law. We do have the help from UK and Canada, but we need other countries to adopt similar methods. We need to combat global corruption by having a standard in order to judge it. And that's where Senator Young and my bill that we've introduced that was passed last year in the Senate, we hope to get it to the finish line this year. We have the support of the Biden administration, would set up a rating system similar to what we do in trafficking in persons. We do have international standards on what you have to do to fight human trafficking. We need the same type of standards established on fighting corruption, and then rate every country as to how well they're doing, with consequences for those countries that are not meeting the minimal level. That's what our legislation would do. We need to advance that legislation. And then working with Senator Wicker, I've introduced legislation that would establish a special fund that we would have available to us to take advantage of opportunities when those opportunities present itself. The Anti-Corruption Fund, funded through the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. You know, we all looked at the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2014 as an incredible opportunity to restore democracy in Ukraine. My own view is that we were not aggressive enough in 2014 with international assistance, and corruption was too prevalent in the Ukrainian government, and we still haven't dealt effectively with dealing with it. We need to have that capacity to move forward in stopping corruption. And then another bill that Senator Wicker has advanced that was also included in the legislation last week, the TRAP Act, to not allow corrupt regimes to use a red notice through Interpol to block or arrest dissidents in their own country. This bill would provide resources to those who determine who the real abusers are, or we enforce a red notice under Interpol. This past week, a caucus was announced in the House of Representatives that was under the umbrella of the Helsinki Commission against foreign corruption and hypocrisy. We're going to have a similar caucus in the in the United States Senate. We're moving forward. And my last point, Mark, before opening it up to your friendly questions, because remember, you are likely to be on the other side of these questions at some time in the near future. I'm sure there's another nomination in your future. The last point I want to make is in regards to international partners. We also need to engage the international partners in this effort. And I specifically want to talk about the United Nations. I think the Sustainable Development Goals are one of the bright spots of what we were able to do with the full global community. Through US leadership, we were able to get Goal 16, which deals with good governance. That needs to be financed and carried out. And the Western powers need to come together to support that Sustainable Development Goal. So we have the global community also working with us in establishing standards for fighting corruption. The bottom line is I'm optimistic because we have a president who has now said very clearly our foreign policy is going to be embedded in our values. That's what our foreign policy should always be embedded with. All of what we do should be seen through our values in the international community, the development of rule of law, human rights, and good governance, and efforts to fight corruption, so we can in fact have a secure supply chain. I think the Helsinki report puts a really fine point on this and the urgency for us to act. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Cardin. I share your sense of optimism, certainly coming out of the G7 and NATO summits and the declarations coming out of them. Sure, they're symbolic, but that's what summits do, right? They project symbolism. And I think that shared purpose is something that we should all be optimistic about. One of the things that I really like about this report is the fact that it is not only aspirational in the sense of talking about the importance of projecting values, but it has some specific recommendations. And one of them that struck me for taking on corruption is building on the extractive industry transparency initiative so that you would have certified secure supply chain products. That initiative, the extractive industries may not have been perfect, but it certainly was a huge step forward. Do you see a similar possibility here on the security of supply chain side?
Excellent point. I'm smiling because we're still trying to implement Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is the transparency to the extractive industries. I don't know if you know the whole history here, but I worked very closely with Senator Lugar to include that in the Dodd-Frank so that we could take these resources that have become a resource curse for so many countries to just use to finance corruption rather than help deal with the wealth of the people where these resources are located. And we had bipartisan support to include that provision that each of the contracts be disclosed so that you can trace the dollars and make sure they're going to the people. We had a challenge because the petroleum industry very much fought us on this. And we were successful in getting a rule out of the SEC, only to see it blocked in court and then ultimately blocked by a Congressional Review Act. And now the SEC just this past week noticed on their agenda for this year the regulations in regards to Section 1504. So we are moving forward on that. Last point on it, United States acted and other countries followed. So it is now the standard in Europe and in Canada. We got to make sure the United States is now not trailing the rest of the world on the disclosure of extractive industries. So it's a very important part of our anti-corruption goal. But yes, to answer your question, I think we could. We want supply chain to be free from corrosive influences, whether it's the use of labor inappropriately in the supply chain, or whether it is corrupt regimes controlling the supply chain, or whether it is theft of intellectual property in the supply chain. All of those are security concerns identified in our report to the supply chain. So yes, in order to be able to deal with it, you have to have transparency. Transparency is absolutely essential. It is. You can't deal with corruption unless you know what's happening, and that's why autocratic regimes, the first thing they do is eliminate any possibility for transparency. They do that not just in their failure to disclose, but in silencing any independent entity, whether it's press or opposition figures or civil societies, from being able to operate. So absolutely, we can learn from what we were able to do on the extractive industries and use that for supply chain issues.
And it would seem that another possibility is something we can all point to as we observe the anniversary of USMCA. As that comes up, that was the first ever free trade agreement that had a specific chapter on corruption. And so that's something that we can all point to. Do you see that becoming the model for future free trade agreements? And what do you think the chances are that we can go to existing free trade agreements and try to go back and have such a chapter inserted in those as well?
Well, Ambassador Green, I take pride in this. I offered the amendment to the Trade Promotional Authority bill that included as a principal trade objective dealing with good governance and anti-corruption, and it was approved. There was some resistance, I must tell you, initially from our USTR, saying they could handle it on their own, they didn't need Congress. But here's where we can really benefit from the separation of branches. We can push the executive branch to a position where they have a stronger hand to play with our trading partners. If it's just the USTR that raises this issue across the table with negotiating an agreement with a less than democratic country, he'll have to give up something, or she'll have to give up something in order to make advancements. But when they say Congress won't accept a trade agreement unless it includes a chapter on anti-corruption, good governance, we're in a much stronger position. And yes, we insist upon that. That's why it's a principal trade objective. It must be included. And I do congratulate Ambassador Lighthizer, who negotiated USMCA, for including a separate chapter on good governance. And I might say we also had a separate chapter in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Before we withdrew, there was a separate chapter because that also required a good governance section. So absolutely, I can tell you, I've raised this with the USTR in regards to the current negotiations. I don't care whether it's with a traditional democratic ally or with an emerging democracy or a country that does not have a free market economy. We're going to insist upon a good governance, anti-corruption provisions in any trade agreement moving forward.
One of the pledges that we saw coming out of the G7 was a pledge to essentially create funding or pool together funding, essentially to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, perhaps not entirely on scale, but at least to create available financing for the developing world. My argument's always been, it's not actually how much money you spend, as important as that is, it's how you spend it. How important do you think it is that in all those financing agreements that come out of that they have transparency and they have anti-corruption provisions and emphasize some of the provisions that you're talking about?
Well, that's going to be more difficult. I'm confident about the current administration in Washington fighting to make sure that we deal with corruption. But I've seen in too many trade deals over the years that the economics become the principal guiding factor, and governance is not really what people are concerned about. So when we deal with labor or an environment or governance, those issues tend not to be as a high visibility and priority as other issues. But make no mistake about it, the Belt and Road Initiative is founded in corruption and ignoring the rule of law. And we saw during COVID-19 our vulnerability here. We really do have a major vulnerability to a secure supply chain by the Belt and Road Initiative. And it is using economic pressure on countries, particularly in Africa, but also we see in our own hemisphere and globally by China, to use their economic influence to dominate the trade agreements. And once they do that, they control the intellectual property, whether they developed it or not. They determine all the rules of the game, and it's anything but a secure supply chain from any standard that we're interested in. So how will the free world that President Biden met with this week use the resources they collectively want to bring together to counter the Chinese initiative? The details are not out. I think we need to base that on our principles. We have to help the developing world. I was proud to see the initiative in regards to the vaccine availability and distribution. That's a good first start. It's not enough. We need to do more. I think we have to reach the people. And if our aid reaches, you're the expert on this. If our aid reaches the people, if it's based upon our values, then we have lasting friends and they'll choose to work with us, because there is a desire among all people of the world for opportunity, freedom, and to be able to voice their concerns. That's what America and the West represents in our values. And if we use these resources to promote those values as we promote a stronger future and way of life for the people of the developing world, then we have a much better opportunity to create democratic states in the future.
So my final question, I know our time is short, but in some ways you anticipated it. So one of the striking things to me about this report is it says very directly, doing business with authoritarian regimes has created threats to the security of critical supply chains. And it points out, just as you did, that the COVID experience should guide us in a lot of what we do. How China first nationalized PPE production and withheld it. And then when it did distribute PPE, it was often substandard. And it was clear as a result that the US was unprepared early on for some of the challenges that we faced. So the question to you is, how much do you think this experience with COVID, particularly with PPE supply chain, how much is that going to color the attitudes of Congress going forward?
Well, I think it will have a major impact. Look, I must tell you, I don't know of a single member of Congress that has not woken up to the threat of China. I think we all recognize it. For so long, we were worried about what Russia was doing and maybe Iran, and China was able to sort of grow to its current strength without too much attention from the United States. We now recognize it's got to be an all-in strategy to deal with China. So I really do think we recognize and that COVID-19 was a wake-up call. We saw our vulnerability. We don't want that ever to happen again. Congress took a major step forward with the passage of legislation in the Senate last week, but that was just a first installment. So yeah, I think you're going to see a continued interest. The Biden administration is focused on this. Democrats and Republicans in Congress are focused on this. This is one area that brings us all together, recognizing that we can outcompete any country in the world as long as we're on a level playing field. We're not on a level playing field today. And yes, we can talk about losing some jobs here. That's not what it's about. It's our security and our freedom and our ability to deal with national emergencies, whether they're health related or whatever. And that requires us to be much more sophisticated in our approach of dealing with a country like China or Russia or other non-market economies or corrupt regimes. We have to have a much stronger unified policy. And that's our challenge. I'm confident that they had the attention of the policymakers here in the United States. I do worry a little bit about our allies in Europe. They have much closer trading relationships with corrupt regimes, and it's going to be more challenging to wean them off of those policies. I'll just give you one example, and that is on energy. Energy is weaponized by Russia. They use it as a weapon. Nord Stream 2 empowers Russia, it does not empower us, and it does fund corrupt regimes. So we see that we don't have the unified position of Europe supporting us on Nord Stream 2. So we're going to have those issues moving forward, but that's what diplomacy is about. And I have confidence that we will be the leader on this issue and recognize that we have to have a staying power, that we can clearly beat China or any other country in regards to the economic future, but we have to do it recognizing we can't let them get away with their corrupt regimes.
Senator, thank you for joining us today, and thanks for your leadership. We appreciate it very much. Duncan, back to you.
Thank you, Mark. Stay well, everybody.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Ambassador Green and Senator Cardin. Great honor to have you here with us. And thank you both for setting up our following conversation so well. We're going to move into the panel segment of our event today. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome to the Wilson Center Paul Massaro, who is one of the authors of this incredible report on titled The Ties That Bind. Paul is a policy advisor to the Helsinki Commission. Paul, great that you could join us today, and thank you so much for sharing your intellectual property with us at the Wilson Center. Secondly, we have Elaine Dzensky, who is the Chief Growth Officer for Blank Slate Technologies and Senior Advisor at the Center on Economic and Financial Power, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Elaine, you are now a regular participant at Wilson Center events. We're delighted to have you as a member of our extended community. Thanks again for joining. And last but by no means least, a very dear friend of mine, Delia Ferreira, who is the chair of the board of directors at Transparency International. Delia is also my co-chair at the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council on transparency and anti-corruption. Delia, thanks for joining us from Buenos Aires today. One of the wonders of today's world is that we can have you coming in from all different parts of the world. I know you travel a great deal, and you've been in Berlin and now down in the Southern Cone. Thanks for joining us. Let me say a little bit, first of all, about the importance of supply chains for the Wilson Center before turning over to Paul to present the report. As we heard in the conversation between Senator Cardin and Ambassador Green just now, supply chains hits upon so many of the key issues for economic governance in the United States and in the world today. And the issue that we're talking about today, which is essentially the rule of law and governance there in supply chains, is something which is all too often ignored. We have made a decision at the Wilson Center to consider it to be one of the fundamental axes of our conversations that are coming up on critical supply chains. As I mentioned earlier on, we'll be beginning next week with conversations over the critical mineral supply chain. But of course, it goes far beyond that. We've seen the release of the 100-day review by the Biden administration on June 8th. That hits upon some of these issues as well. But it's an area of discussion, dialogue, where we see everybody, every segment of society is profoundly affected. We have obviously the private sector, which has been sideswiped over the past year and a half on this issue. We have government, we have Congress, and of course we even have the role of civil society organizations such as Transparency International that are deeply concerned about the implications of our global supply chains in those issue areas. So this is an issue which matters a great deal to the Wilson Center. It's an issue that matters a great deal to the United States and, of course, to the global community. We're so happy to have you here with us today. Let me just say to our audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please tweet. The hashtag is WilsonSmart. So you can tweet anything you like. Put the hashtag WilsonSmart with a question mark at the end, so we know it's a question, and we'll be able to feed that to our panelists after their initial presentations. First of all, I'm going to ask Paul. Paul, could you please present the report to us, sort of the main focuses of the report, and I guess my basic question is to you is that why is it that supply chains matter so much? And in particular, why does this aspect of transparency, anti-corruption, rule of law matter in the management of supply chains? Over to you, Paul.
Well, thanks so much, Duncan. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here. I mean, to have the Wilson Center publish this report is also just an absolute honor. And I'm so happy that Senator Cardin, chairman of the Helsinki Commission, was able to speak today as well. It's just a fantastic thing that this all came together the way it did, and as well for your launch of the Critical Supply Chains Initiative at Wilson. So I see this as the beginning of a very important partnership as we bring the rule of law to this discussion, which I fully agree, for such an important discussion, this aspect has been largely absent. So it's terrific to kind of be able to bring it to the fore and have the opportunity with you to discuss it and do a deep dive on it in a more sophisticated way. I'd also like to highlight that last week we launched the Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy in Congress, 18 bipartisan members of Congress who are dedicated to these issues, exactly these issues, rule of law, democracy, human rights, and fighting this authoritarian wave driven by corruption and kleptocracy. And it is this month, the Counter-Kleptocracy Month initiative of the caucus, and we are introducing a bill a week and highlighting stories and highlighting stuff like this. So this is really just wonderful, the timing of this, how it all turned out, to be able to launch this report, launch the initiative within this wider initiative of the caucus and Helsinki and counter-kleptocracy, and now also the president's declaration of corruption as a core national security interest. It just all seemed to have come together like serendipity. So it's very, very exciting to be here. So I want to echo something that Chairman Cardin said, and that's, it's jobs, economic prosperity, all very important stuff, but this is about security and freedom. And that's really, I think, one of the core issues that I feel like sometimes fails to come across as we discuss supply chains, which often tend to be thought of in this very technical manner or even military style manner when you're thinking about, okay, what products are national security products, what aren't, and so on and so forth. Whereas we really should be thinking about rule of law, democracy, human rights, the things that make a market transparent and accountable. So I think to start off, I want to talk about the report in its two sections, its threats and responses, but just some top line items, and that is security means rule of law. So when we think about secure supply chains, we'd be thinking about rule of law supply chains or supply chains, commerce bolstered by the rule of law. And I think just in a very core sense, if your courts are influenced by the government, if they're not independent, if there's a lack of rule of law, if companies and partners within certain markets are state influenced, and so on and so forth, then these supply chains are not secure because they are not under the rule of law. So the conclusion of this, the kind of 2-second conclusion, is we need to build the rule of law, and we need to build rule of law markets and work very hard to do that. And we have a number of bills and initiatives, including the Crook Act, which I can get into later, as well as even in USAID right now, Samantha Power is just the administrator Power has announced this $50 million rapid response project to build the rule of law and to assist new reformers and that sort of thing. So we need to build the rule of law, or we need to find markets where it exists. So I think in the short term, it's really moving things around. In the longer term, it is working hard to build the rule of law and to expand the rule of law. But you need to do both, and you need to do them at the same time. So the fundamental challenge of all of this is what essentially amounts to a free rider problem. It is that dictators want to pick and choose when they have the rule of law. And the rule of law only works if it's only truly the rule of law if it is applied equally and always. But dictators want to have the rule of law for their dirty money. They want to have it when they need to silence journalists, when they need to engage in transnational repression, and so on and so forth. And then they don't want it when they, engage in projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, or want to bribe officials to gain market access, and so on and so forth. So it's always this kind of thing where they like it, they need it, cronies need to hide their money, they need to have access to it, there need to be this kind of rule of law outclaves, but their preferred structure would be that you have the rule of law in the West and only in the West and nowhere else, so that they can engage in this kind of corruption and manipulation and so on and so forth of markets, and ensure that supply chains remain insecure, that they remain easily malleable to the informal whims of corruption. So this is, of course, easier said than done. Bringing rule of law everywhere is very difficult, and we're dealing with a huge host of private entities, and then we're dealing with the authoritarian problem of ostensibly private entities, where we don't really know who's private and who's not, or even if private entities exist at all. Is there such a thing as a Chinese company that is not state influenced? I think that the answer to that is increasingly becoming clear, and that is no. And that is no in the Russian context too, and so on and so forth. That, if you get big enough in one of these authoritarian markets, you essentially become a state entity or state influence. So those are the top line items. Getting to the report, the first half of the report, we identify threats to supply chains. And these threats are born of exposure to authoritarian markets. And these threats are IP theft. This is a very well-known threat, very problematic. There's been a number of responses proposed, but it is a top line item. And I think when people think of supply chain security, often the first thing to come to mind is IP theft. So the second threat is defective and substandard products. Ambassador Green just spoke about this with Ambassador Cardin, or Senator Cardin. So I will not belabor the point here, but this is a really huge deal. This is, actual stateside deaths. This is the way that, one of the ways that average Americans are just very, acutely impacted by supply chains. One of the reasons why, no matter who you are caught in these supply chains, and that's why it's so important they be rule of law supply chains. The third threat is human rights abuse. Of course, this includes the risks of complicity in genocide, even like the CCP's forced labor in Xinjiang and the genocide of the Uyghurs. And of course, we as a human rights respecting rule of law country do not want to be a part of this supply chains that's dealing in this sort of thing. And then of course we don't want to see it at all on Earth. So it's a huge threat and a huge risk. And of course human rights are the core of long-term international and national security. So we have to be thinking about that. The fourth risk is customs and border operations. The manner of corruption obviously, often goes right through here. And then there's also just port screening issues and all sorts of stuff like this. So it gets to the really nitty gritty of goods coming in and out of the country, and do we know what's coming in and out of the country, and so on and so forth. The fifth threat is data privacy and security. This is another very well known. The key to, I think, what is the PRC's ultimate vision, and really any authoritarian country's ultimate vision of digital authoritarianism and the ability to control information flows, control what people see. Very important stuff. The sixth threat is a lack of transparency. Very clear thing here, moving away from international standards and engaging in all sorts of opaque investment, corrosive capital. Belt and Road has been brought up already, will probably be brought up again in this discussion, but the idea that we have all these hidden clauses, hidden loan agreements, debt burdens, bankruptcy, bribery, and so on and so forth, and we just don't know what's going on. And then finally, and I think the problem behind the other problems really is this issue of free riding that I discussed. So this is really, I think, where the rubber meets the road, and that is the idea that authoritarian regimes want to pick and choose where the rule of law applies, and democratic regimes want the rule of law everywhere, always, and we have to have it, or else it's not really the rule of law. So the report also goes into a brief discussion of foreign supply chains in the US and CFIUS and so on and so forth. So that's very important stuff. But I also think that that's been more exhaustively discussed in other reports and in other approaches. And then finally, we actually argue against the idea, and I, again, kind of discussed in the top line items, but we argue against the idea of trying to pick and choose critical items or critical sectors. We really want to focus in on rule of law. So getting to the responses segment of the report, we identify 4 qualities, 4 traits that make for a secure supply chain. First is transparency. Transparency is critical. We need to know the ownership structure. There needs to be transparency at all levels, no hidden clauses, no nothing like that. Everything needs to comply with international standards. And this transparency is absolutely critical for anything else to occur. So that brings us actually to responsibility. Responsible supply chains is that compliance with these international standards and voluntary standards. That's responsibility. Accountability is the third trait of these 4, and that is the idea that there are structures in place to punish and deter non-compliance, and these structures, act independently. They are not at the whims of any particular, in a CCP in China's case, or the sort of Russian crony structure, the kleptocracy in Russia's case, or so on and so forth. They need to apply across the board. And finally is resiliency, and I personally find resiliency to be a bit of an icky word, but there's no word quite like it that describes this idea of withstanding shocks and the ability to be able to have something like COVID happen and then not have that situation where the PRC controls all of PPE distribution or something like that. So the real key here is diversification to get to resiliency. So we offer many ideas for response. We actually sort them into 3 tiers. So the first tier is non-binding voluntary standards. The second tier is international law and treaties and that sort of thing. The third tier is national law. So the first tier, we offer an idea of both a company level certified secure designation, something like you could imagine like a LEED certification or something like that. So this would be run by sort of an NGO. And then the second big piece in the first tier is this Secure Supply Chains Initiative modeled off EITI that I know Ambassador Green and Senator Cardin discussed. So I won't get too deep into that, but that's really a critical idea. And EITI has been quite a successful initiative on that front. And the United States has led in that despite some of the setbacks we've seen with Section 1504 that we're working on. Many other countries have adopted those standards. So it's a really successful model for looking at something like this. The second tier with binding international agreements, I think the first thing we really have to do is use what exists. And I think this is in the anti-corruption space, something that we also fail to acknowledge. There's always this desire to take on new commitments all over the place. And I understand that because you get to put your name on new commitments and, we change administrations all the time in the USA and whatever else. But there's so much out there that you can hold countries to, that you can look at a country and say, hey, you have undertaken this commitment already, comply with it. And enforcement and implementation of those commitments is really critical. The other thing I want to highlight in this space is anti-corruption provisions in free trade agreements. So being able to, again, look at what exists, free trade agreements, the absolute architecture of global liberalism, and be able to fit human rights and anti-corruption provisions in those is really critical. And I think that's with USMCA or, up and coming free trade agreements, and it was indeed in TPP as well, the draft TPP. But this is just great stuff. So insofar as we can make enforceable commitments like that, we should. And then finally, the third tier at national level, this is something I could do an entire 15-minute presentation on. This is the agenda. We've actually seen so much of this now. We have a number of bills going forward as part of Counter Kleptocracy Month. We have the Crook Act to enhance rapid response in anti-corruption work. We have global Magnitsky reauthorization expanded and enable us to target more bad actors and that sort of thing. Senator Cardin discussed briefly his Combating Global Corruption Act for tiered reporting on corruption standards, which again is like very naturally helps this space because companies will be able to see, oh wow, is this, to what extent is this country complying with its freely undertaken commitments toward anti-corruption and toward financial transparency and so on and so forth. So that's that third tier, and that's really a very robust space at the moment. I think, especially given the last 2 weeks, which have been absolutely blowout in this space and very exciting. So I guess I'll conclude there and just say that commerce without the rule of law is authoritarianism. That it doesn't work any other way. Commerce is bolstered by the rule of law. That's what makes it sustainable. That's what makes it fair. And that's really what makes it meaningful. So we need to put values first, values before short-term economic gains. And it really, this report is part of a larger push for a proper paradigm shift in thinking about supply chains, in thinking about global economics, in thinking about globalization, where we say, hey, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law is first, and then we worry about short-term economic gains, because we're going to have a lot more economic prosperity in the long run, as well as freedom and security in the long run, if we put values first.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for doing such an excellent job of describing what's in the report and emphasizing the main takeaways. Thank you also once again for partnering with us, and we look forward to partnering with you and the Helsinki Commission on future efforts in this area. And a third thank you for using the word icky, because you know, it's very rarely used here at the Wilson Center, and I think we should use it a lot more, particularly in the context of resiliency. I'm now going to move over to Elaine. Elaine, you were an advisor to this process. I know you had a role in providing input to the report as an expert. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about you know, the question of sort of why supply chains matter, why we are where we are in the conversation about supply chains, and really to talk about you know, two concepts. One is, you know, something that you've written on, you've talked about a great deal, which is the concept of ally shoring and working with allies more closely. And secondly, you know, the role of the private sector and how the private sector should be responding to this. We saw a number of very, very important points in the White House's 100-day review that impact directly upon the private sector. But I'd love to hear your take on that. So over to you, Elaine.
Great. Thanks, Duncan. Nice to see everyone. And Paul, congratulations on the excellent report and really helping to push the convergence of issues that are interconnected, but for a very long time were not seen in the proper light. And I think it's serendipitous, but also it's been a lot of hard work on your part and many others to bring this convergence around economic security, secure supply chains, anti-corruption, rule of law. But this is exactly where we need to be on the conversation. So it's wonderful to be part of it. So I wanted to just quickly take a step back before I get to answer the question you put forward, Duncan. As I was thinking about where we are and where we're going, I couldn't help but go back about 20 years to the last time we had a massive shock to our supply chains, and that was after 9/11. And after 9/11, I was part of the stand-up of the Department of Homeland Security, and I remember we went through a very detailed supply chain review process to identify vulnerabilities and to address these emerging risks, which were around terrorism. We were concerned about the bomb in the box and what was happening in port security, and our suppliers secure and who's infiltrating suppliers. And during that process, we also had to recognize that we had legacy threats. And those legacy threats in a lot of ways mimic what has now come out in the report. And I think this is great because we can acknowledge that trade-based money laundering, smuggling, trafficking, drugs, human rights abuses, they've been there for a long time. After 9/11, we pivoted away from addressing those as the core. We went towards combating the terrorist threat, and maybe to our detriment. So now we can look at these threats, but in a new light, which is the impact of authoritarian regimes and the erosion of rule of law. And what is very clear to me is that corruption in particular is probably the single most important enabling factor when we look at these legacy threats. So again, the fact that we're converging all of this into the right space gives us a better opportunity to think about how to address these challenges and secure the supply chain. So before I offer some specific recommendations on that, I want to pivot now to the concept of ally shoring, because as others have said, unless we have the right governance framework in place and the right partnerships to address these challenges, which are global, they're not just ours, we don't really stand a chance of being successful. So the concept of ally shoring is really to dig deep into those interdependencies, those alliances with trusted partners around the world, and there are many of them, where we can look towards greater integration of critical supply chains, however we decide to define that, and lean into joint economic security, where we can lift all boats, right? We want to bring jobs back to the US. We have an opportunity with pivoting supply chains out of places like China, in some cases to reshore, but not in all cases. So when we think about the long-term economic security equation, where can we go to make sure that we're building the right kinds of integration and mutual dependencies that actually help us? We just heard a little bit about the USMCA and the anti-corruption provisions in the MCA. I think this is actually important because if we really want to move forward with a concept like ally shoring, we should actually start in our backyard. And really, I'm talking about Mexico, where we have huge opportunity. We have highly integrated supply chains, and we have the opportunity to deepen those around advanced R&D, new manufacturing, upskilling workers on both sides of the border. So these kinds of frameworks like ally shoring can help us rethink what an alliance really looks like and how to bring our supply chains into an economic security framework. But maybe going a bit more deeply now around the private sector and what we can do. We certainly have to acknowledge that most supply chains are run and driven by the private sector. So we do need to think about incentives to move systems in the right way. Governments coming in to address rule of law and that overarching governance framework is absolutely proper and appropriate, and that needs to trickle down into how systems are working. But we also need to think about how can we build on existing programs and incentives where private sector entities have already bought in to a higher degree of security. And one that immediately came to mind, and it links back to the 9/11 example, is looking at programs like the Custom Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. This was a voluntary program implemented after 9/11. Many manufacturers in the US and suppliers and carriers are part of CTPAT. It's but one example, but I think it's interesting because it's now become a permanent part of the supply chain environment. However, it's a program that doesn't have an anti-bribery provision. Why not? Why not look at extending existing programs like that to include other elements that become an easier lift for companies to implement because they're already 90% there, but now we're going to add in something further. So that's certainly something to think about. The second example that I think could be very interesting goes to the issue of global standards, where the US historically has done a pretty good job of driving global standards, although more recently, I think we slipped in terms of driving new technology standards, really being at the forefront of processes, whether it's the ISO or other standards bodies. So we need to get fully back into that game. We need to really consolidate our multilateral positioning around standards and how they relate to critical supply chains and how we want to build that economic security. So I'll give you yet another example. On the ISO front, there's an anti-bribery standard, ISO 37001. It's actually not something that's particularly popular in the US because we have FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices related compliance measures for a lot of companies, but outside of the US, it's actually getting some uptake. 36 countries have signed on to the ISO standard around anti-bribery. Why are we not thinking about how to utilize that? Or maybe we need to extend or strengthen that standard or create new ones. My point is that when countries are already signing on, we have an opportunity to make the process go more quickly, especially if the private sector is behind it. In the case of ISO 37001, it's also interesting that China was part of the 36 or 37 countries that approved this standard. So why not try to hold them accountable for what they've already said that they've agreed to? So we need to get creative about how we get down to the operating level, creating the right incentives to support the broader governance strategies that are laid out in this report and beyond. Another thing that I'll mention very quickly is we have new tools that are coming on the foreign policy front. Some of them have been created in the last couple of years. The report talks about the BUILD Act, which authorized the Development Finance Corporation. We have EXIM with new authorities and mandates. We have the Blue Dot Network, which is driving new standards for critical infrastructure development, all extremely important, where we have supply chains behind these efforts that can and should involve Western companies and companies from allied partners that are willing and able to adopt a certain set of standards. So we need to harmonize wherever possible so that we're making all of these components work in a way that supports the entire system moving in the direction that we want. Finally, I'll just end with a quick word on enforcement. This has come up, Paul talked about it, and others. Enforcement is huge, particularly when we're talking about the anti-corruption space. And we do need to get serious about this. And if we can drive a greater alliance around securing our supply chains, ally shoring, looking deeper at trusted partnerships, we have then the formation of a community that could get serious about prosecuting kleptocrats for their looting of public coffers, and that could really send a strong message globally. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to be part of the conversation. Looking forward to how it goes forward, and congratulations to the Helsinki Commission for a great report.
Thank you, Elaine. And we'll be coming back to you, Elaine, and Paul, of course, later on with questions from the audience. So if the audience has any questions, please don't forget to tweet using the hashtag WilsonSmart, and we'll gather those questions and put them together for the panelists. Delia, turning to you right now, you know, I know that you've dedicated so much of your professional life to questions of transparency, anti-corruption. As I mentioned earlier on, I've been very fortunate to work with you over the past year and a half on some of these issues. I've learned so much from you. You know, you've had the chance to read the report and to look at what it says about these twin questions of transparency and anti-corruption. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see that unfolding in the management of supply chains, and perhaps, you know, the role for partners to work with the United States and governments in general on this?
Thank you very much, Duncan, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Thank you, colleagues, and congratulations, Paul, for a wonderful report. It is great, and all these conversations from the first part of this meeting to Paul's and Elaine sound like music to my ears, because it goes hand in hand with our Transparency International new strategy and the work we have been doing. And certain things has been really very important in the report and in this conversation. It is time to move to action. We are fed up with commitments. Commitments are great, wonderful, symbolic things, but they are all there. We don't need new commitments, as I hear Paul saying. We need to implement what we have. And also, we need to implement and enforce the rules that we have. Of course, legislation and conventions can be improved, or can be adapted or modernized if you want. But the legal infrastructure to fight against corruption is already there. It is time to put those rules in action. And one thing which is really to highlight in the report, and also in the whole atmosphere that we are seeing from outside in the US now, and with the new administration, is the idea that we have to work together, because this is a collective action. You cannot do it alone. Governments all over the world cannot do it alone. Of course, civil society cannot do it alone, and the business sector the same. So we have to combine regulation with self-regulation, with enforcement, with a collective action that we simplify in three things: nowhere to hide, no one to help, no impunity. And I think this covers the whole program we have been hearing today, and we can read in the report. Particularly in this time of COVID, when COVID starts, Transparency International issue a series of alerts in the different regions, because whenever we have a humanitarian crisis, the risks of corruption increase. And it did happen, as we alerted. We have seen lots of corruption, but we have also seen the COVID emergency as an excuse for abuse in terms of good governance, in terms of rule of law, in terms of human rights, in terms of accountability. We have seen in some countries, even democratic countries, that audit offices or anti-corruption offices has been put in quarantine, really. And that the urgency has justified whatever you can imagine in the whole catalog of corruption in public procurement. We can list the whole catalog across the world from east to west, north to south. The same problems in public procurement, supply chain, etc. So COVID has enhanced these vulnerabilities, as I think the report mentioned. And we have the opportunity not to rebuild back better. I like to say that we have to rebuild forward better. And that means create the systems or reconstruct the systems or work together under the agreement that we need integrity, transparency, and accountability. And to do that, many important steps has been taken in US and in other countries, of course. And I would highlight, in order to allow time for questions, I would like to highlight three special issues. Number one, the beneficial ownership transparency as a principle that should be there in all countries, for all agreements, for all, as a conditionality for all international multilateral loans or aid subsidies. We need beneficial ownership transparency. We were very happy when we saw the last December, I think it was, the approval of the law in the United States. And that has to do with the nowhere to hide. We need all countries working for that, which means public accessible registers of the real owners of companies. It is impossible to secure a supply chain or whatever else if we don't know who is behind the name of the company. And this register should have verified information. Some of the registers in the world have information about the owners, but the owners are Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or 2-year-old persons. That's not what we meant with beneficial ownership transparency. So we need those registers, and that will be part of the solution. Number two, gatekeepers. We have to guarantee that gatekeepers are not or do not become enablers for corruption. And that's a very important point. And talking about our work in the World Economic Forum, the Global Future Council has just launched during the UNGAS meeting last week, our Gatekeepers Unifying Framework, which is an initiative from gatekeepers to gatekeepers, because there are lots of industries that are, or professions if you want, that are entailed with this gatekeeper function. And not all of them are regulated properly, and some of them are over-regulated and transform the regulation in a box-ticking exercise. So, like bankers, for instance, or lawyers or accountants. We have created a framework that it is easy to apply for gatekeepers as a professional standard, and Elaine mentioned the importance of this standard setting. So that's another thing that we have to work together for this second principle, no one to help. because this has been a crucial issue in the fight against corruption. And the third initiative I would like to mention, it is in the report also, is the Blue Dot Network that Elaine mentioned. I am a member of the Council of the Blue Dot Network, and we launched the initiative formally last week at the OECD, and we presented a survey which reflects that the most important risk identified by investors and government and academics and civil society is the political risk and corruption in the second term. For all infrastructure, and infrastructure is not just building bridges, infrastructure is also accessing the supplies for medical assistance or health assistance in an emergency like this. So these two risks has to be tackled as the main problems if we are going to secure or to have safe or secure supply chains. And this risk has to do with rule of law, good governance, transparency, accountability, independence of the enforcement authorities, judiciary and beyond judiciary. And we have to work on that because, and it is very difficult to work on that. That's why we need collective actions and seriousness on the commitments that governments take or governments express. So the civil society is here to help. And of course, you have to rely on your allies as governments. We have to rely on private sector. They are a main actor in this, but civil society can offer the help in order to guarantee accountability, integrity, without being in the middle of conflicts and for the main objective, which is values first or the common good first, as Paul has just said. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Delia. We've got questions coming in from the audience, and we've got about 12 minutes left. So I've got a question for each of the panelists right now that I'll turn over to you. And the first one, Paul, is for you. And it concerns sort of the internationalization of a lot of these norms. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about how global regimes, rules and international agreements on these issues can be strengthened, and the role of the United States in doing that. A two-part question for you, Elaine. You talked earlier on about the incentives that need to be offered to the private sector. Just coming to mind, regulatory taxation, infrastructure, human capital investments. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. And the second part, which is much more tricky, I think, is how do we keep prices down while at the same time as we make sure that supply chains are secure in this way? One of the things that we've heard from a number of the companies that we're speaking to is they say, look, it's all well and good that you create more secure supply chains, but if they're going to be more expensive, then ultimately the private sector is going to go for the cheaper option. So how do we overcome that kind of price and incentive challenge? And for you, Delia, it's interesting, you talked about hidden ownership there in your comments. And we had a question that came in from Poppy Alexander, who said, how do we strengthen the enforcement to stop corporate bribes by kleptocrat shell corporations, given the hidden ownership issues raised by Paul and by yourself? And actually, there's got one last question I'm going to throw in here, okay? And it comes from one of the Wilson Center's own staff. And it's a comment, first of all, for you, Paul. It says, first of all, sweet Kennan Institute mugs on your shelf behind you. So thank you for the advertising there. But the question, this is for everybody on the panel, actually. Do you worry that the proliferation of cryptocurrencies will dampen the ability to enforce anti-corruption, anti-bribery initiatives with regard to transparency in supply chains? So, Paul, why don't we begin with you? Take a shot at those questions.
Great. I mean, and they're all great questions. So on international standards, and this is really critical. I think there's a tendency to make the international standards and then sort of say, we did it, and then forget about it. And you can't, like, creating the international standard is the beginning of a very long and hard process. And that is you start at one of two ways. You start at the national level and you try to push it to the international level. You start at the international level and then try to bring it down to the national level. And when you start at the international level like that, and we actually just did this with the Rodchenkov Act, with the UNESCO Convention, but you created this UNESCO Convention that has all these principles in it and all this other stuff in it, but then it needs to be legislated at the national level. And then it needs to become it's not even just enough to do that. You need to build a narrative around it. There needs to be resources put into it. Actual enforcement needs to follow, and so on and so forth. It doesn't end at any point until it's a self-sustaining process. And I fear that's never been done in the anti-corruption case. You have this really great set of commitments, whether it be OECD or Greco or UNCAC or whatever it is, and then it's just kind of stayed there. There's been, with a few exceptions, I think, for example, FATF mutual peer evaluation or the OECD convention's mutual peer evaluation is pretty strong. But even then, it could be a lot stronger if you brought in legislatures, if you brought in politicians, if you made this a whole thing. And that's why I think initiatives like the caucus against foreign corruption and kleptocracy are so important, and why the job of these politicians is so important, why parliamentary diplomacy is so important. Because when the politicians care, when they make this their issue, and when they start pushing this stuff, that's when you get sustainability. And that's actually when you start to see enforcement and when you start to see national implementation. I'll give you an example. The Magnitsky Act has been just this, and that of course is corruption sanctions, right? And human rights sanctions, targeted sanctions. But that's been one that started nationally and then went international. And we've seen politicians really grab onto that, sort of make it their thing. We now see, having become maybe the premier tool to fight kleptocracy and human rights abuse. So, I mean, I just fear that legislatures in national politics are often not brought into the conversation enough in favor of working at the international level. And I'd say you need both. And you really need to think about it with both. And you need to come to legislature. You need to talk with legislatures, because that's where the action really happens. And that's where the innovative thinking is, because oftentimes, executive branches or governments or whatever can be defenders of the status quo, can be thinking in terms of how do we retain things rather than how do we change things. So again, legislatures are a wonderful place to do that. So I think that's really a path forward that many more should consider. And just a quick word on crypto. Crypto's really interesting because actually it seems at the moment, and we don't know if this will continue into the future, but at the moment, certain law enforcement friends of mine and so on, prefer if crypto comes up in an investigation because they can actually track it better than, say, like something with anonymous shell companies or anything like that. It's kind of extraordinary that there's a handful of totally anonymous currencies, but the market capitalization of these currencies is just not high enough yet. It's not useful enough. Perhaps it could be used for smaller scale terrorist action or something like that. But in terms of money laundering or kleptocracy, there's a reason there are no crypto kleptos quite yet.
Thank you, Paul. Elaine.
Thanks, Duncan, and thank you for the questions. These are both tricky ones, I think, and I'm gonna do my best. The first question was around incentives for the private sector. How do we really effectuate this shift, this pivot out of low-cost jurisdictions or lower-cost jurisdictions like China and other places? I do think it's worth looking at a pretty broad spectrum of tools to help, even on a temporary basis with that pivot. It could be through some sort of tax incentives. It could be helping on upskilling or reskilling, not only in the US, but if there's an opportunity to pivot manufacturing to a lower cost environment, let's say it's Mexico or somewhere in Latin America, investments in human capital then become very, very important and create some pretty interesting long-term dividends as well. The other thing that was coming to mind is looking at it a little bit differently and doubling down on investments in the smart border. So again, this goes to the kind of the U.S., Canada, Mexico opportunity to near shore, onshore, and where the investment in a smart border where data is moving very quickly, where we have a lot more transparency across supply chains, especially critical ones, becomes a very important part of this operating model that we're talking about. But we need more investment, and it has to start with the government. We can do more on trusted traveler programs and trusted trade, and opening up a lot more opportunities to get information flowing as well. So all of that could be very helpful. In terms of how we keep prices down, I guess the place that I would start on this very tricky question is, are we really accounting for the real cost of our dependency? I don't think so. I don't think we're looking at it in the right way. What is the risk of erosion of free markets? What is the risk and the cost associated with the degradation of democratic institutions and the kind of free and open environment that we want to preserve, and by which many millions of companies and people in this country and other countries have benefited over the years? We need to start thinking about it a little bit differently. Then how we address the issue of pricing looks a little bit different. I also think we need to think clearly about how to incentivize China to do the right thing. It may be a pipe dream that they will want to move in a different direction, but the report talks about the strategy of China +1. So if you can't fully pivot out of China, can you have an alternate option in the event that dependency becomes too expensive? So I think that's a way to put pressure on China to reform. So we shouldn't lose sight of that as well, whether it's through standards or threatening them a bit with lower cost alternatives. And there are lower cost alternatives in a lot of industries, albeit not in every industry. And I think electronics is probably one of the will require a lot more thought. And then finally, I actually am a fan of identifying critical areas. I think there's something to a broad-based governance framework that covers all supply chains, but I do think some are more critical than others. And we can take a cue from what Exim has done, identifying 11 transformational areas of export around emerging technologies and manufacturing, from pharmaceuticals to quantum computing, chips, water and sanitation. There's some really interesting areas where we're on the cutting edge of creating some very new industries and new ways of thinking about mobility and how we're operating. These are opportunities to pivot into the right places as opposed to deepening dependencies in the wrong places.
Brilliant. Thank you, Elaine. Delia.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I will start with cryptocurrencies. I think that technology has bring lots of opportunities in the fight against corruption, but also has created new risks, and cryptocurrencies is one of the risks we are facing. For years, we have talked about follow the money, and you will find the origin of this crypto scheme. And cryptocurrencies, in a way, or some regions at least, are facilitating to hide money more efficiently from investigative efforts. So in terms of organized crime, and particularly in Latin American organized crime, is using cryptocurrencies to mobilize their resources, which is very, very complicated because they are also influencing politics about through the campaign financing, for instance, with this kind of currency. So we have to be careful about that. In terms of enforcement of beneficial ownership, transparency, or disclosure, as with any other enforcement effort, we need independence on the authority that will enforce that. we need capacity. Sometimes the clue is the lack of budget or lack of resources of this institution. So it is created by law. It is the chief or the executives are nominated there, wonderful hearings, etc. But then they don't have the budget, they don't have the resources, they don't have the technology capacity to face such a problem. And third, authority. We need them to have the legal authority to ask the questions, to require the information, and to access the information. And in terms, of course, of the beneficial ownership registers, we need them to be open, central, public accessible. It's not just a one-time exercise of ticking a box and putting some information in a format. It is not enough. We need someone to see that. We need someone to verify that. And we need that to be accessible for people, because investigative journalism and civil society are there to take care also of the information. And this should be shared across the world. It is not an effort that is enough to do it in one country. Nowadays, we have a critical mass of countries that are working in this direction. Also, the multilateral sectors or institutions or meetings are working in that. The Open Partnership, Open Government Partnership is working on this. So we have lots of people working, an institution working for this. We need collective commitment and implementation of this if we want to tackle the problem of corruption. And with corruption, there will not be security, there will not be freedom, there will not be rule of law. So anti-corruption is at the center of the agenda of rebuilding forward better.
Thank you so much, Delia. I can see a future partnership between you, Delia, and the Helsinki Commission. I mean, just the words that you used are so much of an echo of what Paul was saying earlier on. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists today, and of course, Ambassador Green and Senator Cardin, for helping us to launch this very, very important report by the staff of the Helsinki Commission. I'd like to thank our audience for being here, and I'd like to thank the companies and donors who sponsor our work here at the Wilson Center, and in particular our work on supply chains, which, as I say, will kick off next week with dialogues where we're trying to drill down on many of these issues. And for our audience, within the next couple of months, you'll begin to see a series of short reports coming out, which will show the conclusions of those conversations. All that remains is for me to thank everybody who worked on the production of this event. Thanks to all the AV team, as well as the staff of the Office of New Initiatives and Strategy at the Wilson Center. Thanks for joining us, and we will be in touch again very, very soon. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.